Hey guys, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. Welcome to Grade 1, Lecture 9. In today's class, we're going to be going over river play, mainly focusing on smaller pots, with the idea of really concentrating on texture, having an awareness of the way the board texture runs out, how easy it is to connect with, how hard it connects with your range and your opponent's range, is a big part of solving the puzzle of how strong your relative hand strength actually is. We've talked previously in this grade about the importance of understanding relative hand strength, and we've looked at that based on action sequences and things of that nature, but today we're going to look at how board texture affects this key factor. When I look at some of the blunders, meaning the large mistakes made by my students at micro stakes and low stakes, one of the most common themes that comes up time and time again is the inability to adjust your relative hand strength for textural factors. So today's class is very likely to save you a penny or two for sure, hopefully more. So what is textual awareness? Textual awareness is the ability to understand how different boards, meaning 3 or more community cards, affect the state of range advantage and nut advantage. We already know that these concepts are paramount. Equity mapping, which is the ability to understand whether absolute hand strengths like ace high, top pair, jack high flush, these are all labels that we assign to hand strengths in order to quickly understand what we're talking about, but we need to understand that these labels don't actually describe the strength of these hands, because a jack high flush will be very strong on a 3 flush board when it checks all the way to the river, and much weaker on a 4 flush board after a lot of betting. So we have to adapt for that, for texture and for line. But equity mapping is the idea that these absolute hand strength labels will describe much stronger hands than normal in some circumstances and much weaker hands in others. So what we're effectively doing is mapping the true equity of our hand to the label that the hand would be given, the objective absolute hand strength label like top pair, flush, etc. Being able to do that well is a really important skill that separates a professional poker player from an amateur oftentimes. And polarization. How polarized each range is a big factor that affects how aggressive each player wants to be, what kind of sizing they want to use, how often they want to be betting. Polarization has a lot to do with the entire game tree, and how polar each range is partly a function of action. Of course, when you bet really big or overbet, you have a much more polarized range than if you check or take a condensing action on the other hand, like calling. But of course, textures are also polarizing. When the flop comes down king 3, we're already staring at a much more polarizing texture for the player who called out of the big blind than a flop like 7-5-3. On the latter, the big blind's range is going to be pretty merged. He's going to have a lot of low pairs that are losing to the big pairs in the opener's range, but also will have draws of medium equity, pair plus draw, a lot of medium equity hands, whereas on king deuce, it's a bit more the case that the big blind either smashes the flop and hits trip kings or has nothing. Of course, there are a few pocket pairs in between, but these aren't a lot of combos. So just the texture of the flop, the turn, the river, the whole board can affect how polar ranges are. It's not just action sequences or how much money has been bet or how aggressive a player has been that affects that factor. So today's lesson is going to take place mainly on the river, and by this point in the hand, the board will usually have had a lot of opportunities to develop in different directions. Therefore, river textures are some of the most extreme textures in the game, because there's been 5 opportunities for a different array of cards to come down. By the river, you can have things like 5 flush, 4 flush, 4 straight, trips board that's nearly impossible to hit, board that's nearly impossible to miss. You get all shapes and sizes of board, and these really affect the true strength of absolute hand labels like flush, straight, 1 pair, top pair, second pair, ace high. Sometimes ace high is a value bet, sometimes ace high is a bluff, sometimes ace high is in between, as we'll see. So before we start comparing textures, I want to talk a bit about 3 broad categories that are going to serve as our milestones along the spectrum of board texture. It's always good to acknowledge that while poker is a spectrum and things are true in a gradable sort of way, that we can still assign labels that separate one end of the spectrum from the other, and maybe one in the middle as well. And I'd like you guys to note that when there's a lot of betting and calling, ranges become much tighter on all textures than what we're going to be looking at today. What we're going to look at today is going to be, for the most part, unfiltered ranges, or ranges that have only filtered a little bit. That's to say, only a small amount of action has taken place. Maybe flop has been bet and turn has gone check. Maybe it's checked all the way to the river. But at no point today are we going to look at things like raising flop and barreling off, or triple barreling, or anything of this nature, or river over bets as double barrels. We're going to be looking at smaller pots with wider ranges that have done less filtering. So a lot of today's class will teach you how to think about those situations, but we need to remember that triple barreling and playing big pots is a totally different ballgame, and in those situations we're going to need a different set of skills in order to understand what's happening to ranges. But I do hope that the textural understanding will still be relevant there, but we are going to focus on small pots today. For triple barreling, you're going to want grade 3, and there's a very key lecture there that goes into huge detail on how to select bluffs and call down in triple barrel nodes, but I'll leave that for your future, one thing at a time. So the three broad types of texture I've actually used a water analogy. People like to talk about wetness, and I actually hate the term wet and dry. I think they're very silly, as I'll talk about in a minute. But I decided that really calm textures are like still lakes. Not a lot is going on. There aren't very many ripples in the water. In other words, these textures are really difficult to connect with. And what they do is they allow a very innocuous looking hand that doesn't look like it's anything special to actually be quite strong. If you imagine that the lake was still like this and you saw a fish sort of momentarily jump out of the water and then jump back in again, not a poker fish, but a real life fish, you would notice that, right? If it happened relatively near to you, because the rest of the lake is so still, it would be very obvious that that had happened. It would stand out on the backdrop of stillness. And it's a bit like that for hand strength as well. When the board is extremely difficult to connect with, then you're going to notice even minimal connectivity in a major way, like having a pair on a board that's like almost impossible to pair because it's like 8 deuce 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 3. Having an 8 is incredibly strong on most river spots, but having an 8 on king queen jack 8 deuce where everything's a mess is not so strong. You wouldn't even notice it. The choppy C has an average or medium amount of connectivity. You can imagine here if you saw a fish jump out of the water, you might notice it, you might not, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. So merely by having a decent pair doesn't guarantee you'll have that strong a hand on a choppy C texture. This is where hand strength is about average, and then the tsunami is the situation where there's so much going on that it's basically going to invalidate the worth of hands like one pair, even two pair. Sometimes they're not going to be particularly strong hands on a tsunami texture. If you saw a fish jump out of the ocean on this tidal wave, you would not notice it because you'd be more concerned about your whole life being wiped out by a huge tsunami and the loss of your life and home and city and country. So you're probably not going to notice little things. So the idea is that the more stillness there is, the sort of less that's going on the board, the stronger, the more noticeable and impactful, just innocuous looking hands are going to be. Whereas when it's wet and crazy, that's not really going to be the case. Still lake is hard to hit. The tsunami is really easy to hit. Still lake textures are unnaturally innocuous. They drastically promote the strength of absolute hand rankings and will not interact with very much of either player's range, or you could say because they don't interact with much of either player's range, that's why they're going to promote hand rankings in objective terms. If we take an absolute hand strength objective label, like pair of fours, and we apply it to this river spot in a situation where the flop, turn, and river have all checked so far, and in position has the final bet opportunity, and it's just river to 4, in position is going to want to bet that hand for value. Or let's take a constant hand actually in a minute, ace king, and we'll talk about how strong it is across all of these textures. But first, choppy Cs. These are boards which are average in terms of how easy or difficult they are to connect with, and therefore relative hand strength can be estimated a bit more intuitively. It's a bit more of a deviation to the norm. More textures than not are going to be choppy C, meaning that they're going to offer you enough connectivity that any random pair isn't going to be a great hand, but it's also not going to be a completely worthless hand either. Generally, if the best ace highs and mediocre pairs are doing okay, then you're in a choppy C texture. If they're doing really well, you're probably on a still lake, and if they're doing badly, you're probably on a tsunami, because a tsunami texture seriously degrades the worth of some of the normally decent absolute hands like top pair, second pair, third pair, two pair. They turn value bets into checks and checks into possible bluffs. So if you have a hand that is a value bet on a choppy C, it's probably too thin on a tsunami. If you have a hand that's a value bet on a still lake, it's probably too thin on a choppy C. If you have a hand that's a value bet on a still lake, it might even be so bad on a tsunami if you jump all the way from the far left to the far right that it even ends up being a bluff now. The spectrum of objective hand labels, it really jumps around a lot when you change the board texture. Have a look at this, for example. In a small pot on 6-6 deuce 9-4, ace king is very likely to be a very strong hand, and if you've checked all the way to the river with a hand like this and your opponent hasn't bet yet, you might even have some kind of block bet. If you imagine being small blind here, going check check on the flop, check check on the turn, you reach the river with a nut ace high. The nut ace high is pretty good at maybe like 75% equity, and if it's 75% equity now, it's going to be entitled to value bet. At least small, maybe even bigger. So on the choppy C texture, this hand, if you've got to the river quite passively, is not really going to be bad enough to bluff, but nor is it going to be good enough to value bet. Of course, if you do decide to double barrel this hand on the flop and the turn, you may bluff it on the river, potentially, although I think the king of spades on this instance is a fairly bad card, and the hand may check down for a bit of showdown as well, because it unblocks stuff like ace, 8 of spades. So I don't think this one bluffs river, but it would be in a triple barrel node a bit closer to a bluff, but in a node where you've just checked down passively and everyone's got to the river with a relatively friendly action sequence with minimal investment, well, now ace king is just going to be a moderately strong hand that checks. It's not going to be really good or really bad. On a tsunami texture, however, this very same hand is going to be really weak. And in most cases, as a pre-flop raiser, there's a lot of big cards here that are quite good for your range. Jack 10, 9, 8, 6 is not a horrific board for the pre-flop raiser. It's not the best one, but there'll be tons of hands you can value bet on this node. You're going to want to have bluffs, and ace king is going to be really low down your range in a lot of spots here. So you may even end up bluffing this in some spots, especially like 3-bet pots where you don't have a lot of worse hands. Note that ace queen and any other combo of broadways with a queen in it here is going to make a straight, so the idea would be in a 3-bet or 4-bet pot, it'd be very difficult to have a worse hand than ace king. You could maybe have exactly ace 5 or ace 4 suited, but apart from that, this hand would constitute near bottom of range. And of course, bottom of range on the river is one of the most naturally bluffable hands because the check EV that it has is just not really up to much, and therefore bet doesn't need to be very good before it's better than check, because check is worth almost nothing. That's our 3 labels for today. We're going to use these and come back to these time and time again. Definitely make sure that this slide is clear to you and you understand exactly what each of these labels refers to and the difference between absolute and relative hand strength before we move on. Assuming that you're happy, let's go. I wouldn't be a Carrot Poker School lecture without a bunch of fallacies and traps to avoid, so let's start with the snap identification trap. The human mind has evolved in a certain way to make it more likely to reproduce its genetics, to pass those on and effectively survive and stand the test of time. If you believe in natural selection, which most people I think do, then you would be quite willing to admit that we are this way for a reason, but you may also have noticed that in poker that's not always the most useful. Having a fight or flight instinct in poker that misfires, and you can read about this in my book Poker Therapy that you can find on my website. It's all about understanding when your mind is doing something evolutionarily speaking that's a good thing, but it tends to backfire in the realm of poker. When you can understand when those so-called misfires are taking place, it's much easier to catch yourself in the act and correct your behavior before you go ahead and cost yourself EV. So one of the things that the mind does is it makes a very quick identification about the threat level of a stimulus upon being exposed to said stimulus. For example, I don't want you to even tell me what your reaction is here, but just maybe say out loud or speak with a friend or write down how quickly your brain forms an opinion about the threats posed to you by the following pictures. Picture number 1. How quickly did your brain come up with a threat level of this dandelion? Mine does instantly. When I look at this dandelion, I instantly feel a slight feeling of relaxation or calm. I don't feel threatened. There's absolutely no repulsion going on there. Totally fine, but it happens instantly. I'm instantly aware that I'm not threatened by this stimulus. Picture number 2. So this probably elicited a very quick, natural reaction. Not of you jumped out of your chair or you ran away from the PC, because you know that this snake is 2-dimensional and not real. It's not going to jump out of the screen and get you. The Carrot Poker School is not that technologically advanced. Not yet, at least. But this snake is still going to elicit some sort of reaction of, I shouldn't get too close to this. There's a slight feeling of a slight value judgment that the snake is bad or to be avoided or is potentially dangerous. And it's a very muffled and limited, muted response that you get by looking at a picture, but you were probably aware there that your mind still made that judgment instantly. So our brains, whether we like it or not, will instantly judge things. They'll make value judgments on things, both the threat level, good or bad, positive, negative, attainable, unattainable, desirable, undesirable. We'll make these snap judgments really quickly in order to sort different objects in our environment out from one another, and in order for us to very quickly and efficiently make decisions without wasting a lot of valuable time that could be spent hunting, gathering, sheltering, eating, whatever. So because we see so many choppy C textures, these are the average ones, remember, those with medium levels of connectivity to ranges, we tend to snap identify our holding based on what it would be on a common or normal looking board. This is very natural. I live in a world where dandelions don't hurt me. So when I leave my house, I judge a dandelion by what it usually is in this world. I don't judge a dandelion by what it is in a computer game where there are evil flowers going around shooting you and you have to shoot them first. I don't apply that unique standard to the average dandelion. Same with snakes. There are many harmless snakes, but most snakes that look like this, that have blue and purple scary colors, many of them are venomous and they're going to kill you if they bite you and you don't get treatment quickly enough. So when I look at this snake, my brain is quite aptly judging it based on the commonness of the situation, that snakes are by and large quite dangerous creatures. I'm not going, oh, I had a pet snake who wasn't venomous and had no fangs, so I'll judge the snake based on those merits. So it's very natural for us to almost assume that our hand strength is the same as it would be on a choppy sea. That's the normal world. It's by far more common than the especially still lakes or the especially wild tsunamis It's very normal to judge our hand by average standards. When we do this, we don't always give ourselves time to reassess consciously, because I think that the conscious mind has to intervene in this respect and say, okay, normally ace high is not a value bet, normally second pair is only worth a small bet. However, look at how we've got there, and even more importantly, look at the texture for today's purposes. What is the texture doing to that hand strength? Is it changing the normal hand strength of my holding? And remember, today we are looking at spots where we arrived on the river with a wide range, right? We're not looking at these hyper filtered situations. Very often on still lakes, your hand is better than it looks. Action sequence and texture are both important, and if you fall victim to the snap identification trap, you may just call a snake without actually thinking about what this particular environment means. In other words, if you were transported to a world where dandelions tried to bite you, you would want to react to that and not just assume they're regular earth dandelions. So if you're transported to a world where ace king is a value bet even though it's only ace high, or a world where a pair is a bluff even though it's a pair, you need to try and see that world for what it is first before you just judge your hand by what it would be normally. This is the key. So since we're looking at smaller pots today, the action sequences are going to lead to unfiltered and weak ranges. And in these spots are hand strength definitions like second pair, ace high. They're going to be on the strong side more often than not, meaning that a hand that doesn't create a first impression of strength could actually be quite strong, and a hand that seems very weak at first glance might actually have more showdown value than it looks. It's very common for weaker, newer or recreational players to bluff too high up into their showdown value on very, very still lake textures because they don't realize how much of the pot they're getting by checking, or maybe even don't think about checking at all. And it's very common for them to miss value bets as well because they think that hands are actually just normal showdown value, even though they're capable of getting value. I'd say the biggest mistakes that people make on the river in small pots is not value betting thin enough, not bluff catching wide enough, and sometimes actually bluffing too high up into the showdown value as well. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, but usually people are more willing to bluff higher showdown value hands than they are to actually bluff catch with those hands. It's really weird because those hands are actually more suited to bluff catching than bluffing a lot of the time, but you can get that backwards on these textures for sure. So let's start with a relative hand strength exercise. What I want you to do is assign one of these labels to the textures I'm going to show you in a minute, either still lake, choppy sea, or tsunami. Decide when you see the texture of the boards below. And one of these labels to the strength of hero's hand. So either hero's hand is going to be so strong that it can value bet. We know what value betting is by now. If you don't, go back, watch lecture 2. So mediocre that it must in fact just check, or weak enough to bluff. So checking isn't better than betting because the hand is weak enough that it can bluff. Don't worry about the blockers of the hand too much for now when you think about bluffing, because we've not really covered those. We'll cover them next lecture a little bit. But for now, I just want you to think about showdown value. Does it have a sufficient lack of showdown value that it can bluff, or is it too strong? So spot 1, we have this hand. Small blind checks, big blind checks, single raise pot, turn is a 4, check check again, and now small blind has the chance to bet the river. Have a think about this one, assign a texture to this, still lake, choppy sea or tsunami, then assign a label. Write down your answers. When you're done with number 1, move on to number 2, ace, king, jack, 9, 8. We have 6s here, under the gun against big blind, again single raise pot, checks all the way to the river. What does under the gun think about their hand on the river? Again, assign a texture. And then thirdly, ace, ace, 3, 8, 8, and it's blind versus blind back to this out of position spot where small blind has the chance to double delayed c-bet the river. This is what this is called. A delayed c-bet would be a turn bet after flop goes check check. A double delayed c-bet would be a river bet after both flop and turn go check check. So what do you think? Let's start with number 1. I'll assume that you've written down answers, textures, and hand strengths for each of these 3 spots, and I'll begin now with the answer for number 1. 7-7-3-4 king is about an average sort of texture. It's not incredibly wet. Just because there's a flush there, that doesn't make it a tsunami. Not all textures that have flushes possible are tsunamis. Flushes are visually striking, but they require a very specific configuration of hole cards to actually connect with them. You have to have 2 clubs, which is not so easy. When 3 clubs are out there, clubs is of course going to be the least commonly held suit in the hole cards because so many of them are already blocked or present on the board. So 10s here, under normal circumstances, is not a massively powerful hand on 7-7-3-4 king, but it's a really important one to bet here because it's still a value bet. And the reason this hand comfortably qualifies as a value bet is partially because the texture is not massively wet. It's definitely not a tsunami. It's not still lake either, okay? It's an average texture, but the main thing is the late position nature of this battle renders ranges very wide, and secondly, and more importantly, the action sequence of just checking all the way to the river allows this hand to just retain a lot of its equity that it had pre-flop, although there's a flush possible as 7 is out there. Villain might have hit a king on the river. There's not enough of the time that those things have happened after this passive action sequence collectively for this hand not to be a bet. So this is strong enough to value bet, and it's a choppy C texture. Question 2, we have Ace King Jack, 9-8. This is a board that's much wetter. When you think about how tsunami-like a texture is, think about how easy it would be to miss said texture. How difficult would it be for Under the Gun to actually have nothing here? The answer is incredibly hard, because Under the Gun doesn't open combos like Queen 4 offsuit that would give them a ton of air. They also don't have 2 low cards beneath the Jack, or 9 or 8 very often, so usually Under the Gun just has a hand that's at least a pair here. This is a tsunami texture because neither player can miss this board very easily. Big Blind can miss it more easily by far than Under the Gun, and this constitutes a very favourable world for the Under the Gun range for in-position player here. However, both players are going to be hard pushed to miss this board at high frequency, and so hands that don't look very good are actually even worse than normal. So 6s, this is a hand that in a choppy C environment would just be showing down for a check, right? You'd be like, okay, I've got like 4th pair, 5th pair. This is just a check down hand. It's not good enough to value bet. But that's actually the wrong question. The question Under the Gun should be asking themselves on a tsunami texture such as this one is actually, is this hand weak enough to bluff? And I believe the answer is a comfortable yes. If you're not bluffing 6s here, it really does raise the question, what are you bluffing with? You might open 5s sometimes, but how do you have an unpaired hand here? A little bit of 7-6, a little bit of 6-5 that you open pre sometimes, 5-4 perhaps. But remember, you would have bluffed earlier on in the hand with a lot of these at a high frequency. So when you get to the river with 6s here as Under the Gun, it's very important to understand that while your hand might show down for a smidgen of showdown value, like it might get a little bit of EV by checking, you're in a very favourable world for your range, and therefore your fold equity is guaranteed to be fairly high, and you should in fact just bluff here. 6s is a bluff because of the tsunami nature of this texture. Number 3, Ace-Ace-3, 8-8. This is almost impossible to hit. While Ace King Jack was almost impossible to miss by the river, this one is the complete opposite. The thing with Ace-Ace-3, 8-8 is that unless you have an ace, and you would have said something about that earlier quite often here as small blind, you don't really have anything. An 8, okay, maybe, but you're going to bet that a lot on the turn or the flop as a bluff as well. So when this board checks all the way harmlessly down to the river, Queen X is actually showdown value, believe it or not. You need to have a weaker hand than this to bluff here, so still lake texture for sure, and I wouldn't be bluffing with Queen X. You may be bluffing with like 10x, Jack X, something like that, but the queen is actually just going to be the main hand that is the median of your range here. The king is going to be a value bet under some circumstances here, like you can definitely block bet for value with king high. It's so hard to hit this board in this late configuration with very minimal action and range filtering up until this point that actually the middle of your range is around queen 7. It sounds ridiculous to say that this complete airball looking hand is just middling in showdown value, but it is. But here's the thing. A lot of newer players would be much more likely to bluff in hand 3 than they would in hand 2. Even though that's completely backwards, your relative hand strength is much, much worse in hand 2 than it is in hand 3, but because we begin in poker by learning the absolute objective label for our hand, like pair of 6s, 4th pair, or on the case of the queen 7, we might be saying something like queen high, air, nothing. But the thing is that you need to bluff the 6s, but not the queen 7 here, and you need to value bet the 10s. So hope this exercise has shaken things up a bit for you. I want to say one more thing before I move on, and that is an argument for the outright rejection of the terms wet and dry in poker. I feel like it's very important to reject wet and dry because they don't actually concern themselves with how difficult or easy a board is to hit overall. For example, a flop like Ace Queen 7 is quite easy to hit when you're an under the gun raiser, but we call that a dry board. Similarly, a board like 5-4-3 is quite difficult to hit as an under the gun player, but we refer to that as a wet board. Wet and dry seem to merely describe how many straights and flushes are objectively present without engaging with the exact range of any player or the position from which they've opened or called pre-flop, and certainly without thinking about the other ways in which you can connect with flops, which are actually more commonly making a pair or two pair than they are making a flush or a straight. Trips is also a very common hand because you just need to have one card of that rank in order to hit it. So while Queen Queen Jack Rainbow is referred to as a dry board because there are no flush draws and no straights possible, that board's actually really easy to hit in a 3-bet pot small blind against cutoff. So I'm not really sure that's the right way of thinking about it. I think we should use Lake, Sea, and Tsunami, in order to reflect what is going on in terms of overall connectivity and not just get blindsided by the appearance of cards that are all the same color or close to each other in rank. Okay, range geography. 4 reference points when it comes to figuring out where you are in your range and the absolute versus relative hand strength of your hand. So range geography is the skill of knowing where different strength bands of hand begin and end. Obviously, a strength band is like a place on the equity spectrum. So when you say that your hand has between 60 and 70% equity on the river because you're estimating, and therefore you know you can block bet that hand or check out of position, you're making a value judgment about the hand's worth in terms of its equity, but you're not doing it exactly. So range geography is never about nailing an exact EV or equity in a sim before you look at it. It's about estimating, and the more you look at sims and study GTO and do courses like this one that are theoretical in nature, the better you get at estimating the objective and relative worth of your hand in various spots. So there are lots of different thresholds within ranges, just as there are lots of different reference points on the globe. When you look at the globe, the world there, you can pinpoint Europe, the UK, the Americas, Africa, Australia, and you can use these as landmarks to decide where the rest of the world is. For example, if you know that Africa is in a certain place, you'll know where India is relative to that if you have any sort of geographic competence at all. Many people don't. I actually show my students in a live course a picture of a country, which is coming up in grade 2, and ask them what country it is without showing the rest of the world. And this really illustrates that sometimes it's much easier to know where you are if you have reference points and you can look at parts of your range in relation to other parts and thresholds, and not just like try and go straight to what to do with your hand in isolation, blanking out the rest of your range or the rest of the globe. So there are 4 different landmarks in a range that are very important to think about, just as the continents are important landmarks on the globe. How we express these depends on whether we're looking at our range from the bottom up or the top down, just as how we look at the world depends on whether we're working north or working south. If I was only moving in a southward direction, I would have to say that starting from Johannesburg in South Africa, I would have to say that Scotland is south because I'm only allowed to move south, and if I go south for long enough I will reach that point. However, if I want to get there faster, I probably go north. Is that even true? I don't know, but you get the point. You can let me know if that's true or not. There are 2 types of threshold in poker: bottom-up thresholds, where we start by searching from the bottom of our range and moving our way upwards, sort of scanning up through our range and noticing things as we go. And secondly, we have top-down thresholds, where we do the very same practice, but beginning at the top of the range and working down towards the bottom. A bottom-up threshold that's really important is the point where a hand becomes good enough that it's too strong to bluff. By recognizing the geographic location, so to speak, of this threshold within your range, you're able to distinguish spots where betting would be a mistake because checking actually starts to give you a higher EV. Another bottom-up threshold, when you continue moving further up your range from weak to strong, is going to be the point where a hand becomes good enough that it can value bet. Missing this point or neglecting to think about it properly and in relation to the texture is one way in which people just make mistakes. If you don't ask yourself, am I in a still lake, am I in a choppy sea or a tsunami, it's hard to actually pinpoint where this is. So texture is actually really relevant when you're defining where these thresholds are. Top-down thresholds are sort of the inverse of these bottom-up thresholds. They're just the point slightly after it or slightly before it, depending on which direction you're scanning from. For instance, threshold 3 here is a top-down threshold, and this is the point where a hand becomes too weak to value bet and must check. This is basically the inverse of 2. When you're moving up the way, you pass 3, hand that's just too weak to value bet, and then you reach 2. But when you're scanning down the way, you reach 2 before you reach 3. And then threshold 4, this is the inverse of 1, the point where a hand becomes weak enough that it may bluff. So we've said that bottom-up threshold 1 is, okay, we've reached a hand that's too good, now it's not going to bluff. But when you're moving the other way, you reach a hand where you're like, aha, this one is now weak enough that it can bluff. It doesn't have too much showdown value such that checking is better by virtue of the hand being mediocre. Let's practice this with a reference to the types of board that we've been learning to distinguish thus far. We'll start off with the still lake. Let me remind you that still lake textures commonly lead to players underrating how strong their hand is. This happens usually in practice because the more common choppy sea textures, and they are by far more common, it's actually really difficult to have a still lake texture, in the same way that it's really difficult in deuce to 7 triple draw to have 7 high. You have to just miss absolutely everything in order to have that. It's really hard to have a really bad hand, just as it's really hard to have a really good hand, right? So it's really hard for a texture to be extremely impactful, just as it's very hard for it to be extremely still and quiet and innocuous. So actually, the most common by far is the choppy sea, the average texture. So they often serve as our template for making quick value judgments, as we saw before with the dandelion and snake thought experiment. And hands that are much stronger than they first appear are really where people fall down. So actually missing thin value bets, missing bluff catches, that sort of thing, maybe even bluffing too high up into the showdown value. These are all the kind of mistakes that are made in still lake textures. Still lakes and the innocuousness of the runout have a very impactful effect on range thresholds. Whether we're working down from the top or up from the bottom, this is always going to be true. For example, in this situation, small blind bets 1/3 on the flop, big blind calls, turn goes check check, and we have this bet check bet opportunity. You'll probably know by now that this is not a particularly favourable world for the small blind player because they've been called by the big blind, and then the board is run out in an uneventful way. The big blind will preserve the status quo from calling flop, which was that their equity has gone up and is going to be much higher than it was when the flop first came down before any filtering took place. However, when we get to the river, small blind will still have some value candidate hands. They will have like really good ace highs, pairs, etc. that they can value bet here, and big blind will not have a lot of apex, having checked back on the turn, and will be very ace high and king high heavy himself. So what are the bottom up thresholds, guys? Have a think about this. At what point in small blind's range does a hand, in your opinion, become good enough that it's too strong to bluff? What is the first hand, scanning from the very bottom of range upwards, beginning at like 5 high and moving upwards? What's the first hand where you say, aha, that hand is too good to bluff? Where is that? This is a really good practice. Pay particular attention to this exercise. Scan up from the bottom, do it consciously. Where do you think this hand is in small blind's range in this action sequence? For the river, for this spot with the question mark as always. Once you've done that, have a think about where does a hand become good enough that it's strong enough to value bet. So in other words, continue to scan up further. Where does the second point reside in the range? Once you've done those, try doing it from the opposite direction. This is a kind of mental gymnastic exercise. Starting now at a hand like quad deuces or pocket eights, which small blind should slow play, going for a check raise on the turn, being out of position sometimes, and should have here on this node. Where does a hand moving down the range become bad enough that it can no longer value bet? This is going to be a very close point in the range to point 2 in the bottom up thresholds, but it's just going to be on the other side of it. And where does a hand become bad enough that it's allowed to bluff? This one correlates with bottom up threshold number 1, where the hand becomes good enough that it's too strong to bluff. Well, just below that, you have a hand that's bad enough that it's allowed to bluff when you're moving in the opposite direction. Once you're happy that you've written down an estimate of hands here, I don't want you guys to look this up in a solver. That wouldn't be productive. I want you to try to get there yourself. I'm not advocating that people cheat in game by running solutions while they're playing, so why would you do it here? You want to hone your skills, not just get the answer. No, don't spoon feed yourself, just as this course doesn't spoon feed you. I'll assume you've done that. And this is number 1. The first hand moving up from the bottom that's good enough that it's too strong to bluff is king 5. That is to say that if you have this much showdown value or more, then you will not be bluffing. You may reach a point where you're value betting, but you will not be bluffing. Moving up further to threshold 2, you can begin value betting here at a decent ace high or better, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen, ace king. These are all value betting that might come as a surprise, especially given ranges have already undergone some filtering via the flop action sequence of bet and call from small blind and big blind respectively. These hands are still bets on the river because 1, it's a very wide range configuration, 2, not much filtering took place, and 3, and most relevant to our purposes today, it's a still lake. It's very hard to hit this board, so a good ace high is a very high equity hand. Not many people find this value bet, and I don't think that's a terrible thing because a lot of people don't bluff catch enough here either. But if you bet third pot again here, you'll see plenty of people just shrug call with king queen, just in the hope that you're bluffing, or flick it in with an ace. So ace 10 can be a value bet. It's going to return probably a bit more than 50% equity when called, but it'll be there or thereabouts. It's a very thin one. It's the first hand, after all, that you're allowed to value bet. Number 3 is ace 9 of diamonds. This is the first hand when you're moving down the way that's bad enough that it can't value bet. Makes sense, right? Because ace 10 was the last bastion of the value betting range. Ace 9 is the first point that has to check for showdown value at the top of the checking range. The mediocre band of hands that has to check for mediocrity is going to have a value border and it's going to have a bluffing border. Just as Belgium is going to border Germany and it's going to border France and it's going to border Holland, just as countries border other countries and states border other states, we're going to have hands, ranges bordering other ranges, and I guess in this analogy, certain cities that lie on the border between one country and another are going to be analogous to hands like ace 10 or ace 9 that lie on either side of the border between two countries. So I really like this analogy of like geography and range geography. I think it's a really nice way to think about figuring out where you are in a range. Number 4, therefore, is going to be the other side of King 5. It's going to be across the border from that. King 5 was the first hand moving from the bottom up that was good enough that it didn't have to bluff. Therefore, King 4 is not clearly good enough that it doesn't have to bluff and is right on the fence in terms of showdown value. There will not be many hands in this spot like King 4 that have just enough showdown value that betting and checking are the same EV. Most hands here are going to be either pure bets or pure checks. If you're wondering what these numbers are, they're just the frequencies that certain lines are being taken in equilibrium. I wouldn't worry about that too much if you're thinking about these numbers down here. They're not that important. Okay, so still lakes. Definitely all of our thresholds are a little bit lower down the absolute hand strength spectrum than you might think. Let's move on. Let's talk about choppy Cs now. So as we said, choppy C textures are the most common. Students are generally a bit better at evaluating these because they are common and you're just used to them. They provide the set of circumstances relating to how difficult or easy it is to connect with a flop, turn, or river that we're more used to. So therefore there are less mistakes in people's hand evaluation, but there are still mistakes because the action sequence in particular positions, that kind of thing, can have such a big effect on relative hand strength. Queen 9-5, 6-4. When we look at this situation, again, I would like you to go through the thresholds. Where does a hand become good enough, moving from the bottom up, that it's too strong to bluff? What's the first hand that cannot bluff due to its showdown value being too high? Where does a hand become good enough that it's strong enough to value bet? The first hand that's actually that good in our range. And then try the top-down thresholds that will be the other side of the border from these. Where does a hand become bad enough that it can't value bet, and where does a hand become bad enough that it's allowed to bluff for the first time, being devoid enough of showdown value? Again, have a go. See how well you do. This is a very useful exercise for your development as a player, so please do attempt it. Even if you find it hard, give it a bash. It's much better to try and learn from your mistakes and write down where you went wrong by comparing your analysis to mine than it is to just say, this is too hard, take me straight to the answers, spoon feed me. That's not going to work. Poker's too tough a game for that. So, this is the answer to 1. Ace-7 of diamonds is the first hand that is good enough that it's too strong to bluff. So anything below this lousy ace is going to bluff. King highs on this texture are going to bluff because this texture is a choppy C. It's relatively easy to connect with, but not massively so. Therefore, ace high assumes its normal position as a showdown value, middle of the road or middle to low equity hand that's able to check. Depending on the ace high, obviously ace king, ace jack, that kind of thing is going to be way more of a check. It's just far more strong. Number 2 is something like 7-6. This is good enough to value bet. You might be like, well, that's only third pair. Why can I value bet that? Reason 1, wide ranges. Reason 2, passive action sequence with only passive filtering, not aggressive filtering. Reason 3, it's not that wet a texture. It's still a choppy C. So we can go ahead and bet third pair after it's checked all the way to the river in a wide range spot like this. The other side of the border of 7-6 is going to be ace-5. If 7-6 is the weakest hand that we can value bet, then a pair of fives is not good enough to value bet. This one is going to be a check. Sometimes students say, but Pete, is it going to be a check call or a check fold? Probably it's going to be a check call because it unblocks bluffs by having an ace kicker. But I would also say that's not that relevant. I don't want you to worry about what you do if you check. It's a very natural thing to try to control everything as a human and plan everything out and not feel like you're underprepared or not responsible for what's going to happen next. But here's the thing, whether your hand is good enough to value bet or not is down to its equity, and that doesn't determine what it's going to do against a bet, because when it faces a bet, ace-5 will become a bluff catcher, and then we have to decide how good a bluff catcher is, and it's actually a separate thought process to solve that. So what I would urge you guys not to do is to obsess about what you're going to do after you check with this hand and actually let that influence whether you check or not. Whether you check or not depends on whether you have sufficient justification for betting, and if you don't, you check and then you figure it out. Don't complicate the game tree by trying to solve spots you're not in yet. Finally, number 4, where does a hand become bad enough that it's allowed to bluff for the first time? Well, we already know that ace-7 is too good, so we just need to go a little bit lower down, and when we get down to ace-3, we see the solver start to fire a few, I guess, bluffs with this hand. I wouldn't do this personally, because I would imagine the hand was still good enough to check, but I can see why king-jack, king-10 are bluffing here. The thing is, there's not much of a difference between a hand like ace-3 and king-jack. On the one hand, when you have king-jack, you unblock more ace-x, and you want to therefore bet, because there are more better hands that are folding. When you have ace-3, you chop with some ace-x, not many on the slow board, but maybe like ace-deuce or ace-3. Even ace-7 is going to play against you, right? Pretty harsh. So that's another thing to notice, is that you don't actually get much chop EV with ace-3 here. That would be very different. If there were more higher cards, and then ace-7 and ace-3 would play very much the same, but the kickers are actually playing here, and they're kind of relevant, right? Whether you have a 7 or a 3, as crazy as that sounds. Let's move on to the tsunami. Tsunami textures shake ranges up dramatically. They really are the X factor that just causes chaos and means that hands are just not what they seem in any way. Newer players in particular can be prone to overvaluing marginal hands on these boards. We've all seen the classic spot where we river a straight on a 4 straight board and we pot it, and for some unbeknownst reason to us we get called by 2 pair, and this is meant to maybe happen sometimes in equilibrium, but we definitely observe weaker players in general just paying off bets on weather boards with hands that normally sound quite good, like having trips, having 2 pair, having top pair, having pocket aces, but they just fail to recalibrate their hand strength for the fact that the board has run out really horribly. And so in Tsunami textures, I'd say it's easier to notice when your hand has been ruined by a Tsunami texture than it is to notice when it's been subtly promoted by a Still Lake. I would say for people like you guys, I say this in a kind of filtering way, I'm assuming that you guys have purchased the Carrot Poker School, at least I hope you have, and you're enjoying the school and watching it and learning from it. You're probably serious players that are quite intent on improvement and probably already know a few things about the basics of the game at least. Therefore, you're quite likely to notice that a 3+4 straight texture degrades 2 pair heavily. I'm not like inferring that you're not going to notice that, but a lot of recreational players don't, or at least they ignore it because it's convenient to their desire to invest money. Small blind, preflop raiser, check calls this monotone board. When you see a monotone flop, it's already very likely that the texture may end up being a Tsunami because it's already most of the way there, and unless the turn and the river are both deuces that are not hearts, it's going to turn out that way. The fact that there are 4 cards above a 9 here, I have this rule that when there are 3 cards above a 9, the texture may well be a Tsunami, and when there are 4, it probably always will be. Even if it's not 4 flush and 3 straight like this texture is, even if it's not a mess in every single possible way, having a bunch of high cards is always going to make the texture harder to miss and easier to hit by virtue of the fact that people just selectively play higher cards much more often than lower cards pre, and most importantly they do that in the offsuit variant of the hand more, so offsuit cards are really abundant combinatorically, mathematically speaking, so when you have offsuit hands prevalent in a range, that range is always going to occupy more unpaired slots, if you will, than when it's just suited cards. So this board is very hard for each player to miss. It's possible you can fathom having the 5-4 of diamonds here and getting to the river with nothing, but by and large there aren't a lot of those combos that have absolutely zero going on. Let's do our thresholds again. I won't run through these every time now because you've already thought about them, they're already familiar to you, so I'll just give you a few seconds, and with that I'll assume that you have paused and unpaused the video, and I will now go over the answers to this one. Starting from the bottom up, where does a hand become good enough that it's now too strong to bluff? The answer is a pair of 10s, shockingly. If you have a pair of 9s here, as the small blind player, and you've strengthened your range by check calling the flop, remember, condensing action, and then you've arrived on this river opportunity with a 9 or a 6 or pocket 5s or anything like that, don't think you would check call 5s no heart on the flop anyway, but you get the point, you now have to bluff. 10-7 is the first hand that has enough pot share by checking that it doesn't have to. I want to draw your attention to a very subtle fact here that's really actually quite striking when you notice it, and that's that 4 flush cards are a lot better for the preflop raiser than the preflop caller. This is almost invariably true regardless of the action sequence, because the preflop raiser, if we go right back to the origin of ranges, which is preflop, has opened all of the combos of kings, queens, jacks, 10s, ace, king, ace, queen, 2 big cards, but big blind has not got those in this single raised pot because of course big blind would have 3-bet many of those hands, some of them all the time. So if you have more big pairs and big offsuit cards in your opponent, you're going to like a 4 flush river more because you're going to make more sizably strong flushes. So that's another reason why the small blind can value bet so many hands and therefore is going to be bluffing so high up into their range. They just don't have a lot of weaker hands in this after checking the flop and then calling, and their range is doing so well overall that you want to be bluffing hands that even have some showdown value, hands like 9x, just not quite 10x. If your opponent is too capped and is overfolding the river, you may even go a bit higher with your bluffs here exploitatively and start bluffing 10x as well. It doesn't seem that absurd to me. 9-6, therefore, this is a hand that, well, 9-6 is a different thing actually. This is a hand that's good enough that it's now strong enough to value bet. It looks a bit weird, 2 pair here. If I'm bluffing a 10, am I really value betting 2 pair? The answer is yes, because the hands that you're checking are just in the 1 pair region. You have a lot of like pocket kings, queen x and ace x here, pocket jacks and 10x that are checking. That's your mediocre belt of hands that's checking for mediocrity. 9-6 is a little bit above that. As I said, the big blind player has a lot of suited cards. They don't really have that many combos of flushes on this node, therefore, so we don't have to worry about it. With a 9 and a 6, we have 2 pair. as long as our bet is small, and you'll note from that light shade of orange that the solver is only using the smallest bet there. It's 100% B33ing with 9-6, it's never checking, it's never betting bigger. That's okay as long as we keep it small, because this hand is a fairly substantial favourite before betting, and therefore has enough equity post-betting to go ahead and do this. Number 3, where does a hand become bad enough if we're going from the top down that it can't value bet? That's going to be the Ace-8. This hand is just a little bit too weak. We're going to need to have 2 pair here. Ace-Jack as well, maybe something like that can fit the bill also. Ace-King, but these sort of Ace-X hands, they all play very similar because of course the big blind player doesn't have a lot of Ace-King or Ace-Jack in their range here when they don't 3-bet pre. They have some Ace-Jack, but not so much Ace-King. And then King-9 is an example of a hand that's allowed to bluff. Of course, if a 10 was the first hand that was too good to bluff, a 9 is going to just be pure bluffing. You might look at King-9 here and just never think to bet this hand. You just check down automatically. You're like, okay, I have a pair, I still have a pair, let's just hope it's still good. The idea is that this has now catapulted its way all the way down to the bottom of your range. Meanwhile, your range has got stronger. A really useful axiom when it comes to understanding how your relative hand strength is changing based on action sequence and texture is to ask yourself, do I have a weak hand in a strong range? Because if the answer is yes, you may well have to bluff, and this happens a lot on Tsunami textures, where your hand was formerly mediocre, but it's now just the bottom of your range, and your range has got quite strong, but your hand is bringing up the rear of it and therefore has to bet. That's how polarization works, at least on the river, where it's the last chance to bet. So hopefully that was a useful set of exercises. It's quite hard work, but it does pay dividends. It definitely allows you to sharpen your mind when it comes to understanding how relative hand strength can really just change so dramatically based on textural differences. Before we wrap up for today, I'd like to touch on Raising the River. There'll be a lot more of this in grade 2, but for now, let's suffice to say that Raising the River works much the same as betting. There's a polarized range. In general, though, our thresholds are going to be higher up. We're going to have more standards about blockers for bluffing. We're going to need to have a better hand for value raising. Why? Because we're already facing an aggressive action from villain that polarizes villain's own range. What this means is that we can't just apply our normal criteria for betting when we're facing a bet because we're actually making the second bet. We're repolarizing. We're polarizing after our opponent already polarized. So therefore, there are less hands we can get value from. The idea is that polarized ranges, like our opponent's range when they bet the river, and it might not be massively polarized, but it's going to move in a direction of polarizing. These ranges are going to contain higher concentrations upon betting of 2 types of hand, and we do not want to value bet thinly against those types of hand in general. For example, a villain has a lot of very good hands that are capable of betting for value. They don't need to be very good, but they need to be quite good. Then these are likely to beat thin value bets. So if we just have like 70% equity, we don't want to raise with that. We need more because the very high equity hands our opponent is value betting are commonly going to beat us. So we don't want to inflate the pot against them. And if villain is bluffing, of course, there is absolutely no reason to raise villain's bluffs. If I saw that you had a bluff in GTO and I had the nuts, I would still just call, because your bluff can't call my raise anyway, and I would just pay more rake. Of course, I can't see your cards in real life, so I never check back or just merely call a bet with the nuts, but the idea is that I can't raise you if you have air and expect to get called. So polarized ranges, they start to specialize in having high equity hands and very low equity hands. Therefore, they don't call raises that often with a mediocre hand because they don't have a mediocre hand in the first place. And that's why you, when you're facing a bet, have to be a bit more selective about what you're raising in the first place. Let's go back to double delayed c-bets again, blind versus blind. Small blind checks this flop and big blind checks behind. The turn then goes check check as well, and small blind B33s on the river. Big blind has the chance to call or raise in this spot. Have a think about what big blind's going to be raising, where are the thresholds in big blind's range here. Give the video a quick pause, have a think about it, write down some answers to the threshold questions. Well, here are some solutions. 3s has too much showdown value to bluff here. Call is just too good with this hand, especially 3s with the 3 of diamonds having a positive blocker. Note that villain can't really have the 3 of diamonds in a bluffing combination because that would involve them having an offsuit hand containing a 3. People don't play those hands pre-flop, therefore the only 3x in his range are suited 3x, and therefore the 3 of diamonds is only a positive blocker, never a negative one, but more about that in lecture 10. The thinnest value raise for us here is actually King Jack. King Jack is a really good hand to value raise on this node because nothing has happened. This is a choppy C texture in case you didn't work that out already, meaning that hands are kind of what they seem. The idea here is that small blind is actually betting bigger here with a lot of queen X or flushes, or betting earlier in the hand, and therefore if you have a jack here, you actually have a very high equity hand, and you can see that the EV of raising small is similar to the EV of calling. This is an optional value raise. It's right on the border between just calling and raising for value, and of course, as long as you don't raise gigantic here, the only option that loses EV is that raise 120% pot. You don't want to use an overbet raise size, but you can raise 60% pot, have a small raise and a big one in your toolkit in these spots, and only choose the small one with a thin value raise, of course. Jack 10 is slightly too weak to value raise. This combo is just not by much. It's not going to be a disaster if you raise this hand, but it's going to be a slight EV loss in theory. So you'd only want to raise this hand against someone that was especially capped for this bet size and just never ever had a queen or something like that. And your highest showdown value bluffs here are things like ace 10. If threes is a bit too good to bluff, you can start bluffing when you get down to ace high. One thing you'll actually see in spots where you have a raise river opportunity is that most of the hands that are raising river are also calling. We tend to derive our raises from our calling range and not our folding range when we face aggression, because we're repolarizing. We need to have higher standards. What we actually want to do here is interfere with our combinatorics, with our cards that we're holding in our hand, with villain's value range, and that will allow both call and raise to be good. What you don't ever want to do here is get here with the 5-4 of spades, a hand that doesn't block any of his value bets and does block lots of his bluffs, and raise it because it's the quote-unquote bottom of your range. You want to avoid that because the hand can just make 0 EV by folding. It should always fold, and the EV of repolarizing and raising with a hand like 5-4 of spades is going to be negative. Therefore, when you're picking your bluffs in this spot, stick to having some kind of interaction with the board blocker-wise, and a hand like ace 10 with a 10 of diamonds is a really good candidate for that. Here's the homework for this week. In the following spots, can you identify a hand that's slightly too good to bluff, slightly too much showdown value, and then your thinnest value bet? We're going to then reveal the answers for each of these spots. Pause the video, have a think about it. Spot 1 is going to be this river probe opportunity for big blind, having called flop and gained a range advantage. The board runs out 5-10, and big blind has the chance to probe bet river. And in question 2, big blind again has the chance to probe bet the river, having called on this run out. The queen is not such a great card that comes down here, but it's okay for big blind. Big blind still calls flop with some stuff that relates to that. So I've given you some clues there, but have a think about where these thresholds should be, write down your answers, and then I'll show you my findings. Okay guys, now on to the answers. Question 1, slightly too much showdown value to bluff, is going to be pocket deuces. This is a hand that's already getting 33% of the pot by checking. It's doing incredibly well here showdown value wise. You'll notice it's also getting a ton of the pot by betting. Now why is that? Is it that it's value betting? No, not at all. There's actually just an abundance of fold equity for big blind in this spot. Big blind's range is doing very well after calling the flop. While we're getting kind of massacred when the flop first comes down, when we call the c-bet, we obviously improve our equity considerably, as we've seen. And when turn then goes check check and button's range weakens again, we have a river card that's not actually that bad for our range. And the reason for that is that while button will be barreling a lot of their gut shots containing a 10 on the turn, we're actually going to call a lot of ours on the flop. So this is a river card that might not be as bad for range as you may think. It's not really hitting a lot of button's air because so many of those combos have already bet. So although we can get quite a lot of fold equity here and bluffing is very plus EV, it's better to check due to just reaching this point, this threshold in our range where we have enough showdown value to return a higher EV by checking than by betting. Our thinnest value bet over here is going to be 9-6. This looks a little bit loose. It looks quite thin indeed. But this is going to be fine when you factor in the fact that there's not a lot of 10x or king x in button's range, because of course the in-position player is going to be incentivized to bet those and just increase pot size with those hands on the turn for value. So 9x is coming in at quite a lot of pot share here regardless of what it does. It doesn't own enough of the pot to be considered a standard value bet because its starting pot share is only about 58% pot, but because we're out of position we can afford to value bet here, maybe still have about 50% when called. As long as it's there or thereabouts, out of position, it's not a big deal to value bet really thinly because checking isn't so hot either. You know, we're not closing the action by checking here as we would be if we were in position. On to question 2, slightly too much showdown value to bluff. There is a 7. This hand is doing a lot worse percentage pot-wise regardless of what it does than the hands on the left, and this is actually just due to the texture being less favourable for the big blind player. The queen is going to be a card that hits not just straight draws and stuff that we floated flop, but also some random airball hands like queen 4, queen 5, queen 6. Note that the 10x equivalent on the left is not so prevalent in button's range there. So the queen is a less good card, also ace queen, just really common holding. The button has that we never have. You can't really say that about ace 10 on the left hand side, so you can see that this is a worse run out and therefore EV is generally lower. That means we have to be a bit selective and we don't get to dip all the way down into showdown value. To bluff, we want to bluff some hands that are void of showdown value like king X and below here, but we don't want to reach up into stuff like ace high. It's going to return a slightly higher EV by checking them by betting, but it is going to be close because this is a threshold hand. Our thinnest value bet, meanwhile, is Jack 6, which might look thin, but of course many of the straights, 2 pairs, sets, and Queen X over pair combos plus in buttons range are going to bet turn because they're going to rush pot growth there. So it's not such a bad hand. It's not entitled to loads of the pot, coming in at about 70% pot share in EV, but that's easily enough to block bet for value. Alright guys, I hope this lecture has clarified a lot of stuff to do with board texture for you, and I do hope that the terms Still Lake, Choppy Sea and Tsunami may become part of your terminology quite soon. I will see you on lecture 10, and I hope you've been enjoying grade 1 so far. Bye for now guys.